in the arid Tarim Basin in northwest China. Not everybody believed the early British reports of Caucasian mummies, but then more were found. The oldest of all showed up in 1979 at the Gomuku Cemetery, which had 42 graves, most of which dated between 2100 and 1500 BC. There were two types of tomb at the site, belonging to two different time periods. The strangest thing about the mummies is that they were white people. The oldest mummy is called Lulan Beauty, and she was a white woman who died 3,800 years ago in China. The oldest ones from Gomuku were Caucasoid, but other cemeteries, such as at Yanbulak, contain more recent burials of Mongoloid Asiatic peoples. More than 30 mummies were found at the Bronze Age Xiaohe tomb complex in an oblong sand dune. The complex contains about 330 tombs, about 160 of which have been violated by grave robbers. Some Tarim Basin burials are in boats, despite the absence of water. This resembles burial customs among the ancient Nordic peoples. This one is known as Chia Chen Man. Notable for his red hair, his stature at nearly 2 meters tall, and his European-style tartan trousers, which were the oldest ever found, until another pair of trousers was found quite close by, which are 400 years older, making them over 3,000 years old. Trousers were first invented by early Indo-Europeans of the Eurasian steppe, so they could keep their legs warm while riding the first domestic horses. Analysis of the mummy's woolen garments reveals a typically European tartan-like pattern, which the Chinese did not use, and that it was made from a kind of wool typical of European sheep. Chia Chen Man's clothes closely resemble fabrics from the Hallstatt culture of Iron Age Central Europe. The bodies are well preserved due to the dry and salty conditions of the desert. Some of the bodies had symbols painted on them, such as these on Chia Chen Man's face. This woman was tattooed. Quite similar to later Scythian women who have been preserved, such as this reconstruction of a Siberian Scythian woman. One of the mummies shows evidence of having undergone surgery with horsehair used for stitches. He, like others, had lung disease from breathing in too much sand. These people had very tough lives, and their men were forced to hunt vultures, badgers, lizards, and snakes for food. The Taklamakan Desert of western Xinjiang takes its name from an old Persian saying meaning, "the place of no return." Temperatures range from 40 degrees Celsius in summer to -20 in winter in this inhospitable region, almost as large as Germany. Even though the earliest mummies are white Europeans, the more recent mummies, from as recently as 550 BC, are mostly Mongoloid. So, did these white people all die out? Where did they go? The answer may lie in medieval Chinese manuscripts. The Tarim mummies aren't the only evidence of white people in ancient China. In 1907, the German scholars Sieg and Müller identified a newly discovered language from Tarim Basin manuscripts of a people the Turks referred to as Turu. The Germans incorrectly identified them with the Tokari tribe, who were actually an Iranic people. But more about them later. Nevertheless, we call the language Tokharian, even though that is wrong and it is not Iranic at all. For the rest of this video, I will refer to the speakers of this mysterious language as Tokharians, but not the actual Tokhari. The manuscripts reveal 3 divergent languages known as Tokharian A, Tokharian B, and Tokharian C, all dated from about the 4th to the 13th centuries AD. They belong to a unique Indo-European isolate family, distinct from any other Indo-European language, even the East Iranic languages of the Tokhari. Tokharian A and B diverged from Proto-Tokharian sometime between about 600 and 100 BC. These languages indicate that people were isolated from other Europeans and to a lesser degree from each other for a significant period of time. It is tempting to assume Tokharian is an isolate that developed in China, but we can't fill the gaps between the late Neolithic, when Proto-Indo-European was spoken, and the medieval times when Tokharian manuscripts show up. So what do we know about the so-called Tokharians then? Here's a famous wall painting of Tokharian princes from the cave of the 16 sword-bearers in the Tarim Basin, dated to 432 to 538 AD. You can see their colourful European hair. Contemporary Chinese sources also refer to European-like people in Western China. These barbarians of Yekin have deep-set, bright amber eyes, roundish ears, and narrow faces. Their place is high, arid, and distant. The king is called Son of Heaven. The number of horses in the kingdom for riding and pulling chariots usually amounts to several 100,000. Its people have pink skin and are used to shooting arrows and riding horses. They are the tallest among the barbarians in the western region. Those barbarians of today who have blue-green eyes and red beards, whose appearance is like that of the rhesus monkey. Its king is called Americ. He has 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. If one of his children does not have 6 toes and 6 fingers, he will not raise it. When they have children, they compress their heads to make them narrow, and they tattoo their bodies and have blue eyes. Their king's surname is Pai. Min personally led the people of Zhao to butcher various barbarians. They slaughtered all of them without discrimination of social status, gender, or age. The dead were more than 200,000 in number. He put the bodies outside where they were eaten by wild dogs, jackals, and wolves. At that time, more than half the people with high noses and thick beards were massacred. While these accounts certainly refer to white people living in Western China, it is not easy to tell if they refer to Tokharian or Iranic people. Tokharians were Buddhists and therefore had a religious connection to India. The Tokharian A word, Arsi, means ordained beggar monk as a noun, and Aryan as an adjective, and is derived from the Indo-Aryan language Prakrit. Therefore, Tokharians literally called their Buddhist monks Aryans, at least in Tokharian A, which might have been their liturgical language. It was spoken in a town known as Arshi in Tokharian, derived from the Sanskrit Agni, who is the Hindu fire god. So some people want to call Tokharian A Agnian, but we don't know what it was actually called by those who spoke it. Tokharian B speakers were the dominant population of the Buddhist kingdom of Kucha, and natively they called the language Kuchian. So did the Tarim mummies speak Proto-Tokharian when they were alive? I don't think so. The thing is, we actually have accounts of Iranic-speaking peoples living in Western China before Tokharian manuscripts show up, which makes this a bit more confusing. The Uesi were an ancient Iranic-speaking people. Now, Iranic does not mean they come from Iran. Rather, their language is related to Iranian. As I explained in my Aryan invasion video, the Proto-Iranic speakers were white European people living on the Eurasian steppe, and some of their descendants, Iranic-speaking steppe peoples like the Scythians and Uezi, were also white, or at least they had European ancestry. Busts from Uzbekistan reveal the obviously European phenotypes of the Yuezhi. The Yuezhi were closely related to the Scythians in all respects. From Fergana to Persia, although their forms of speech are different, their customs are generally the same, and they can understand each other. These people have deep-set eyes and a lot of facial hair. They are very good at business and wrangle for every money. Much of what we know of the Buddhist Yuezhi kingdom comes from Buddhist scriptures brought eastward into China by Yuezhi translators who translated ancient Buddhist texts into Chinese and thereby accelerated the development of Buddhist philosophy in China. In the first millennium before Christ, the Yuezhi had inhabited the western part of Gansu province in China, which is about 500 miles east across the grasslands from where the Tarim mummies were found. One of the main Yuezhi tribes were the Kushans. In the early 1st century after Christ, the Kushan prince, Kujula Kadphises, united the 5 Kushan divisions into a confederation of which he became emperor. He broke away from the control of the Hellenized Bactrian dynasty to the south and founded the Great Kushan Empire, which encompassed the Sogdians, who I will get to later, and spread all the way down to India. Manga fans may recognize the name Kushan from the Berserk series, in which there is an eastern empire called the Kushans, led by Ganishka, and this character is based on a real Kushan king called Kanishka, who was actually Kukula's great-grandson. In 1979, a Buddha statue was found dating to the 4th century, and it was made by Yuezhi immigrants from Kushan. The inscription refers to Buddha as Buka, which is a Tocharian word, showing that Yuezhi people adopted Tocharian lexicon and must therefore have been in close contact with them, and that they probably mixed and therefore had Tocharian ancestry. The Yuezhi are often conflated with the Tocharians, even though, as I said, Tocharian is a completely different language to Iranic. The Greek Strabos, Geographica, written in the 1st century, related that the 4 nomadic tribes that took Bactria from the Greeks were the Asi, the Gassiani, the Tokhari, and Savarauli. It is likely that one or all of these were Iranic-speaking Yuezhi, but it is perhaps possible that one may have spoken Tocharian, but not the ones called Tokhari, because that referred to a Yuezhi tribe and not the people we now call Tocharians. Anyway, as far as the Chinese and Greeks were concerned, they were all just nomadic barbarians. The Lower Tarim was part of a kingdom called Kroraina, known by the Chinese as Lulan Kingdom. The Han Chinese Emperor Wu invaded and subjugated the area in the 2nd century before Christ. This is the same area the ancient Tarim mummies are from, and some people think this area was home to Tocharians. The art of Kroraina certainly shows Western, mainly Greek influences, but the administrative language of the region was not Tocharian, but Gandhari Prakrit, which had been imported to the region along with Buddhism from northern India. The Buddhist pilgrim Faxian, who stayed in Shanshan in 399 AD, described how the people there practiced the Indian rules and customs. So even if Kroraina had been Tocharian, it was heavily mixed with various Indo-Iranic Caucasoid peoples by then too. Documents from Kroraina also show that Sogdians were present there by 313 AD, and by 664 AD, a Tang Chinese Buddhist monk, Xuanzang, mentions a place there called Nafupo, which could derive from a Sogdian word, Navapa, meaning new water. Sogdians were another ancient Iranic people with possible Tocharian ancestry. They also mixed with their Scythian neighbours. Their homeland, Sogdia or Sogdiana, included parts of modern-day Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Their culture lasted from the 6th century before Christ to the 11th century AD. At various times they were under the influence of the Persians, the Greeks, the Kushans and the Chinese. They became powerful when they controlled the Silk Road trade for a while, and are depicted in Tang Dynasty era Chinese art as Western merchants, sometimes riding camels. This terracotta model of a Sogdian from China also shows an obviously European phenotype. Single-humped camels are not native to China, so their presence in Chinese art is a nod to interactions with Western peoples like the Sogdians. Even the native Bactrian camels only live in the arid regions of Western China where Sogdians lived. The Sogdians originally followed Indo-Iranic religions like Zoroastrianism and Buddhism, but they eventually all converted to Islam by the 11th century, and Sogdian was replaced by Persian, which in turn was replaced by Turkic languages after the Turks converted to Islam and mixed with the Indo-European occupants of the steppe to create the modern peoples we know of Central Asia. The East Iranic and Tocharian peoples were almost certainly closely related at the time they are recorded in Chinese sources. But just because they were both white and lived in the same area doesn't mean they were the same people. Indo-European languages are divided by linguists into two broad categories, Kentum and Sartum, according to how certain dorsal consonants sound. Tocharian belongs to the Kentum branch of Indo-European languages, along with Western languages like Celtic, Greek, and Latin, while Iranic languages, such as Persian, Sogdian, and Scythian, belong to the Sartem branch, along with the Aryan languages like Sanskrit, and the Baltic languages like Lithuanian. This means that Tocharian must have broken away from Indo-European very early on, and been isolated a long time ago. This phylogenetic tree from a paper by Russell Gray and colleagues calculates that the ancestral language of Tocharian A and B broke from the main Indo-European tree nearly 8,000 years ago. This means these people must have left Indo-European areas and moved, presumably to China, long before the oldest of the Tarim mummies died less than 4,000 years ago. And it makes it seem very likely the mummies were Tocharians, except for one thing: the genes, and I don't mean these trousers. In 2018, a study by Hollard and colleagues showed that most males of the Afanasyevo culture of Neolithic South Siberia had R1b1a1a male Y haplogroup. Now this, combined with its proximity to Western China, makes the Afanasyevo people a likely candidate for the ancestors of the Tocharians. Many prominent scholars, including David Anthony and J.P. Mallory, proposed this theory even before genetic evidence was available. But this paper actually revealed that male Tarim mummies of the Xiaohe cemetery all had R1a1a haplogroup and were therefore more likely related to the Andronovo culture of Central Asia. How frustrating! As I explained in my Aryan invasion video, the Andronovo people were the Proto-Indo-Iranian language speakers, also known as Aryans. However, it is worth noting the mummies in Tarim had a specifically European branch of R1a, rather than the one usually associated with Indian and Iranic people. Another genetic study from 2019 by Ning and colleagues tried to identify the source of European DNA in northwestern China. It published the genomes of 10 ancient skeletons from Xinjiang dated to around 2,200 years ago at an Iron Age Shirinzigu site. They were mixed race, with both Asian and about 20 to 80% European ancestry, which was Yamnaya related, coming either via the Afanasyevo or the Andronovo people, and therefore they were associated with Indo-European speakers of the steppes. The paper argues that these skeletons were Tocharians, but subsequent analysis of those genomes by the independent geneticist Eurogenes has found they bear a close affinity with the Tianshan Huns, and are therefore more likely to be Huns. The Shirinzigu males have a mix of Indo-European R1b haplogroups and the more typically Asian Q1a Y haplogroups. These men were likely a mixture of Saka Scythians and Asiatic Huns, who replaced the Saka in the western Tian Shan region, so they either spoke Iranic or Hunnic, but probably not Tocharian. So if the Tarim mummies are Andronovo-derived Iranics, not Afanasievo-derived Tocharians, and if the Iron Age people from Shiranzigu are Iranic or Hunnic, then that means we don't actually have any Tocharian DNA, which means there is a great big gap of about 6,500 years between when Tocharian theoretically broke from Proto-Indo-European and when the first Chinese records of their language appear. That makes them even more mysterious than the Tarim mummies, who themselves may at least have known who the Tocharians were. In 2019, a comprehensive thesis about the Tarim Basin mummies by Yun Yang was published via Uppsala University in Sweden. I actually applied for the archaeological research position that Yang got, but it's just as well he beat me because his work is very interesting. He identified the changing burial customs of the Tarim Basin in the early Bronze Age. The north of the basin had stone burial mounds, stone pit graves, and circular or square stone curbs and stone human sculptures. But the eastern part of the desert, around Lop Nur, had wooden coffins buried in sand, with the dead lying straight on their back. But from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age, there was a big shift to stone burial mounds of the northern type all across the basin, indicating that this culture grew and replaced others. It is possible this stone barrow culture was derived from the Andronovo culture, which also had burials with stone curbs and stone pit graves. Are we seeing the replacement of an Afanasievo-derived Proto-Tocharian culture with an Iranic one? And if so, then how come the Tocharian language survived alongside the regional Iranic ones right into the medieval times? Yang notes a fascinating custom extant among the Tarim Bronze Age people. Many mummies in Gamugu Cemetery were painted with a strange, sticky white substance which has not yet been identified. It might be made from dairy products and almost certainly played a religious function relating to the journey of the dead in the afterlife. Maybe it was applied with the special twigs that were also found in these burials. A 2013 study proved that the twigs in the Gamugu and Jiaohe cemeteries were ephedra, which is a native shrub used today in Chinese medicine to treat colds, fevers, and respiratory diseases. Many steppe cultures also made use of the plant, perhaps because of their poor lung health due to the sandy air. These people may have been descended from the Andronovo people, who were themselves also the ancestors of Vedic Indians and the ancient Persians, each of whom had magical, psychoactive religious substances referred to as soma in India and heoma in Iran. Perhaps these ephedra twigs, or the white substance, were related to the soma cult. Further research may yield interesting results in this respect. Some of the women's graves in Jiaohe cemeteries contained wooden phallic objects. These had been hollowed out and cut in half. The insides were painted red to resemble the inside of an actual penis. They were then stuffed with feathers and lizard bones, possibly an entire lizard in some cases, and then tied back up with woolen yarn. The obviously magical cultic objects resemble both the Shiva lingam of Indian religion and also Vulsi, the horse penis preserved with magic herbs by Viking women according to an Icelandic saga. Evidently, it was considered that some women would be in need of a penis in the next life. While it is a surprising and fascinating revelation to many to learn that white Europeans lived as far away as China as long ago as the early Bronze Age, we must resist the temptation to identify these people with the later Tocharians of the same region recorded in medieval Chinese sources. No doubt both were white, but the Tarim mummies are much more likely to be Aryans rather than Tokharians, in the sense that they were East Iranic people related to the Scythians. It is also clear from linguistic evidence that the Tokharian and Iranic-speaking Caucasoids of the region intermixed and influenced each other's languages. It's hard to say what first attracted these diverse peoples of European descent to the unpleasantly arid and sandy region. Perhaps it was trade, and later in history the Silk Road did provide opportunities for them, but ultimately they suffered for the wealth they pursued, with lung disease and genocide at the hands of the Han Chinese.